Jake is if you don't know him, Jake is an extension specialist in Utah State University, Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. And he graduated from the same university with a degree in landscape architecture and watershed science. And he has his research and extension effort focus on analyzing how design of community infrastructure and sites affect water quality, quantity, and conservation at both site and watershed scale. Gateway community design and planning challenges and recreational amenity development and stewardship. So overall, Jake has a lot of expertise on how to design a landscape, especially a water-wise one, which we all need in Utah. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Jake. And Jake, you can take it from here.
Thanks, Sheetal. Sheetal didn't mention in my bio that I'm a big fan of Sheetal's work and enjoyed his introduction here to this webinar. So these are great opportunities to have fun conversations about relevant topics. And I know they span the arc of deep research all the way to stuff like design, which is, I think, a credit to the work that the CWEL's up to and trying to spread, again, both the deep science and some of the maybe lighter information like what I'm going to talk about today to a broad audience. So it was really fun to see all the people coming in. I'm going to be talking a lot of Intermountain West context. So for those of you who may be from Kansas or something, a little bit of that will be to provide context why water-wise landscape design is important in our neck of the woods. And some of it will be sort of inside jokes for Utahns a little bit. So hopefully you can bear with me. So I wanted to jump into things. And what I'm going to talk about today is really how we rethink water-wise landscape design, how we approach this effort, and why it's a challenge, and then maybe more than anything talk about some possibilities that water-wise landscape design can provide. And I want to answer, kind of frame it on these questions. Why is it so hard to do a water-wise design well? Why I think of landscape design as an approach or a process rather than a product. And I think the reason I want to talk about this is I think this idea is liberating for folks that struggle with the product, which in a lot of situations is kind of the pretty picture. It's that thing you see at the end that you think, wow, you're an artist, right? This is something very beautiful. But that's really, in my opinion, the product. And if what you create, what the design product is a napkin with a sketch on it that you are passionate about and makes a lot of sense, then I think that's as good as the beautiful pictures. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing with some communities and what's working and frankly, what's not, because hopefully it will enlighten some of your efforts in whatever sphere you find yourself in. So again, I want to start with this idea of why is water-wise landscape design? It's maybe not hard is the right term, but why is it such a challenge here in the Intermountain West? And in order to do that, I'm going to frame it around this really broad overview of history with copious amounts of sarcasm inserted into an overly generalized storyline. So forgive me, you historians, but this is just going to be a snapshot. And again, it's to hopefully provide some context to what we're struggling with here in the Intermountain West, or Utah specifically, and how that might be applicable to some of the challenges you see in your own community. So in Utah, we can start with a pioneer heritage, a settler heritage. We had people come in led by a gentleman named Brigham Young, and his charge was to make the desert blossom like a rose. That was his both religious counsel as well as a counsel as a city planner and maybe the Utah's first developer. And some of the challenges was that idea of blossoming like a rose was not taken by the original settlers to just add a splash of color, add a few plants to their new desert home. Like anybody else would, the idea of creating home meant creating some place that felt familiar. And the places that they came from did not look like this place they were going to inhabit. They looked much more like this. These were, a lot of the folks that made up those original settling colonies, and maybe even in the community you're from, came from places like this. They brought a style and an ideal of what they thought home should look like that was from a wildly different ecological context. The Europe was where a lot of these folks came from. And the choice, as they came across the east, and they saw those landscapes that looked very familiar, and arrived here in Utah that did not look familiar. And they had decided to adapt, and they adapted the land rather than adapting their design styles to the land. And they did this through a lot of simple yet really elegant infrastructure that moved water from where it naturally occurs to where they needed it and wanted it. And what that's done is kind of created a certain vernacular that has permeated many other parts of the Intermountain West. And we're in this situation here in the state of Utah where we're one of the fastest growing states in the nation. And that's a Utah issue as well as a lot of other Western states. As our population grows, unfortunately, our water resources have not. And that creates a really obvious issue, and something's got to give. And in the last couple of decades, there's been an increased interest in figuring out how to conserve water in all aspects of our living, from our indoor use, our outdoor use, at the residential scale, all the way to the municipal and commercial scale. In the last couple of years, the drought has indicated that we need to do more. And there's been a real heightened interest, especially in outside water use, because it's using an estimated 60% of all potable water in Utah. So how's that going? We've been in dire straits here for the last couple of years. This year, as Chital was talking, we've gotten a pretty significant amount of snow, but we've not been adapting to the land. We are rather continuing to adapt the land to our idea of what home should look like. So it seems like bucking 175 years of creating homes that look like they came from the East Coast or Europe, and sort of taking our take of making the desert blossom as a rose is really, really hard to reverse. Just like our pioneer ancestors, we tend to want to replicate what we know and what we're familiar with, irrespective of the context or the constraints, unfortunately, of what we're living in. And really that, in my opinion, is an example of poor design decisions, right? If we are having to adapt that much, maybe we've made some missteps in our design decisions. And that's happening at the residential scale. It's happening at the commercial scale. It's happening at the neighborhood scale. There's some challenges that we have in the way we develop across the Intermountain West. We're addicted to large lot, big acreages, and we'll talk about why some of that becomes a challenge. So one of the challenges with that or opportunities that's come about is this idea of xeriscape. And to kind of explore people's feelings on that, I'm going to pull up a couple of questions. One about how you feel about design. So the way you do this, if you could open up another window on your computer or open your phone or tablet, go to menti.com. You can see that up in the top, www.menti.com. And it's going to ask you for a code. And then for this specific one, it's 56945700, again, up there at the top. And I want you to answer this question. For you personally, as you think about design, what keeps you from feeling confident in your ability to design a landscape? And just let me know. I'm just curious, what keeps you from feeling confident? And I'll give you just maybe 40 seconds to weigh in on how you feel about this. Perfect. I'll give you about 10 more seconds. You can see this is not a tremendously academic survey. I'm just curious, kind of who's in the room. So interestingly enough, you know, these numbers keep changing, but I think a lot of us would think that other people are worried they're not creative enough, or that they're, you know, just not confident enough. But this sentiment that I see displayed here from the people in this room is very similar to the sentiment I've experienced working with communities and people, talking to them about design. Is a lot of what they struggle with is really that the process of design is very intimidating, and they're not as worried about their creativity or their confidence in it, which is interesting. So my next question is, when you think about the word xeriscape, what is a word? What comes to mind when you hear this word? Go ahead. It's a open answer, like it's going to be a word cloud. Yep. And the more common words, the larger the words will be. So go ahead and share what you're thinking. Rocks, rocks, and rocks. Okay, we'll talk about rocks and gravel. No irrigation. Ugly, I saw show up there. Okay, desert. Misunderstood. That's a very interesting word that's popping up a couple times. Boring. Okay, ouch. I see a beautiful in there. Thank you for someone who threw a beautiful in there. Heat island. That's a concern I've heard brought up many, many times. Desolate. Brown. Hot. Barren. No water. Let's see. Arizona. No scape. Okay. These are very, very common terms that come up when we talk about the term xeriscape. And I hear a lot this idea of xeriscape and xeroscape being interchanged. I guess my opinion is there's this general feeling that to have a xeriscape landscape, it requires you to give something up. There's a sacrifice, and starting from that place is really hard for a lot of people to swallow. And if it's easy to swallow, it's certainly hard to get excited about when you start from a place where you think you're going to give something up. Personally, I don't use the word xeriscape anymore, merely because it's become so laden with baggage in the general public. So I use the word water-wise landscape design. I found it's a lot less controversial, and it's a little bit more accepted. So when I'm referring to water-wise landscape, I'm referring to xeriscape. They're nearly one and the same. And I'll talk a little bit about the steps or the principles of xeriscape, which are not a lot different than what I would consider the principles of water-wise landscape design. Okay, so let's keep moving on here. So what about this idea of xeriscape? Let's take a little bit of a deep dive into what xeriscape actually means. So like people said, a lot of the challenges of xeriscape is people envision xeriscape as this. And maybe it has some of those common attributes that you highlighted. I noticed cactus was in there. I noticed rocks was in there. Those were elements. This one has, an old piece of farm machinery. This one is a wagon wheel. Sometimes it's a plow. You do have a dead animal skull. Tends to be kind of part of the, again, I'm being very sarcastic here. But you see this a lot, right? Some skull, and then this cactus is especially water-wise. It is it's steel or aluminum. So then they sprinkle, some boulders or some larger rocks, a couple of pots with some annual plants poking up there, and we call this xeriscape. Or maybe this is what people may envision when they hear the word xeriscape. And because of that, there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction to this style of landscape. The reality is, I believe that this is a misunderstanding, and something that we're constantly working on reframing this idea. Okay, so the other issue that I see a lot is a lot of folks focus on the details of xeriscape. They want to maximize their irrigation system. They want a list of plants. They want to know, how to catch water off the roof or something. These very detailed things, and people gravitate to them because they're tangible. You can go, they're marketed well. You can go and buy them, this technology or stuff to modify things pretty easy. That industry has perpetuated a lot of this great stuff. These are important, but I see them really as details. I'm going to use a lot of food metaphors, but it's really the icing on the cake. What design really seeks to address is the cake, and then it addresses the icing. Okay, so I'm going to start with the xeriscape principles, kind of get us all on the same page. There's 7 of them, and the top one is planning and design. Okay, so as you look at these principles, they kind of start at this macro level, and the details become more and more apparent as you move forward. Okay, so planning and design really encapsulates a lot of these other principles, but it's this kind of a simple, step 1, but it is a very large and complicated process, and frankly one that can be intimidating for a lot of people. So if it's it seems pretty straightforward and simple, this idea of xeriscaping. A lot of times we start and we're like, I'm going to create this, right? And then we end up with this, or maybe something like this, right? The operationalization of these principles gets lost, and what we end up is examples that maybe are less aesthetic and people are less accepting of in their communities. Okay, and I think some of that is a lot of this is our attempt to replace traditional design elements. I'll talk about what that actually means at kind of a 1-to-1 ratio, right? They're trying to say, if I take out my grass and I replace it with gravel, like it's xeriscape. Okay, and that is not necessarily the case all the time. And that's a little bit like switching out the main course in your meal and wondering why all the other complementary items on the menu don't seem to fit anymore. When you take a pot roast out and you replace it with waffles, and you wonder why the gravy doesn't seem to fit and the green beans, you've made a significant change to the principles of the design, and you haven't really thought about the strategy. So what I'm kind of advocating or setting up here is thinking about water-wise landscape design as a strategy rather than like a single design move. So design really, I guess, looks at the kind of questions that fundamentally alter your options. So if you have rocks to get into your shoe, design asks how to create a shoe that allows the rocks to fall out or keeps the rocks from getting in. That is much different than asking how to accept the rocks in your shoe and limp gracefully. I think a lot of what we've seen in water-wise landscape design is trying to figure out how to make small changes and then limp gracefully. So that's all good and fine, right? You're like, hey, I'm on. That's why I'm on this webinar, is to learn about this stuff. But I've been scratching my head on this topic of how do you teach someone to design? Most designers spend an enormous amount of school learning to kind of go through these processes. I've been really lucky to work with an awesome county faculty here in Utah named Rose Wallen. He has a similar background as me as a landscape designer by education, and then experience in the design and contractor world, and now works as a county faculty. So he and I have been really putting forth effort to figure out a way to make a simple yet universal strategy that's holistic yet effective. And what we find is people are obsessed mainly with 2 things. One, the pretty picture, the product, right? The drawing. And 2, the details. They want plant lists, soil tests, fertilizer recommendations, whatever those sort of like very simple details all are. However, what we find is when we start to ask questions about their design, it reveals deeper questions they haven't even thought about, like how does your home relate to your neighbors? What is the relationship between your home and your street, for example? So what we've worked on for about a year now is synthesizing the design process, the same design process we teach students here at Utah State in the landscape architecture program, into basically 4 steps. And we've been sharing this process through a series of workshops this spring. We've called it Design for Every Drop, and that letter 4, or that number 4, is those 4 steps. So I'm going to walk you through the process that we've been teaching, and hopefully it gives you kind of a taste of what we're trying to share with people to make it more accessible. So notice here that we're going to focus on process, and mainly that is because the steps are meant to be something you hold on to when you kind of get lost, and they're intended to be revelatory. They're supposed to reveal things and expose things you haven't thought about, and hopefully as you go through each step, solutions you haven't thought about also come forward. So the steps that we use is, the first step is knowing your site. Okay. The second step is knowing your needs. The third step is making it yours. And the fourth step is making it a reality. Obviously, step 5 and into eternity is keeping it up, maintaining it, all those other things. So again, these are the very basic steps of any landscape design process. They're just overly simplified. So I'm going to go through each step and sort of talk about how we teach it. And maybe there's an opportunity for you to learn how to apply it, or take some of the ideas of how to apply it into your own property. So the first step is looking at knowing your site. This step is incredibly important, but I find very few, if any, people do this effort, mainly because it's tedious, it's analytical, and it's rarely inspiring. Okay, this is trying to see your forest through the trees. Okay, the place you've already lived or are going to live in. Really taking it apart and understanding, basic dimensions. How big is your home? How does it sit on your site? Where are your property lines? Who are the neighbors? What is its relationship to all these different factors on your own property? And that starts with something as simple as a base map. I'm always surprised at how much money people spend on a landscape or intend to plan to spend on a landscape, and yet have no idea anything about the dimensions of their property. So from something as simple as a base map, we start to think about what we actually have on our site. We call in design this is called an inventory and analysis. We're looking at what influences our site. The wind, where does it come from? When does it come? Where does the sun shine? Where does it not shine? Where are utilities? What are the neighbors like? Where are the hot areas and the cold areas on your site? Are there steep slopes? Where is water being wasted? Where is it coming from? Where does it pool? Where does it leave quickly? Where does noise come from? Where do smells come from? Where are the views? What existing vegetation do you have to work with? What planting zone you're in? Where is water coming from on your site? Is it coming off your roof? Is it coming from your neighbor? Is there an irrigation ditch that overflows? All those kind of questions that reveal opportunities and constraints that you may have not realized before. And these are helping you start the process of deciding what you want to take advantage of and what you want to get rid of. And the site inventory analysis, as scary as that sounds, is simple as this, what you see on the screen. It's spatially locating the opportunities and the constraints of your site. The cool part is, as you dive into this, what it does is it sets a foundation for which good design decisions can be made that are responding to the unique attributes of your site. So the next step is, well, I got to show one more picture. If you haven't done a site and inventory analysis, we end up with issues like this, right? Where we put a tree underneath a power line, and then right as it gets good, we got to chop it up. There are enormous volumes of great pictures of what happens when you don't know your site. Okay, so step 1 is knowing your site. Step 2, also like silly simple, is knowing what you actually need and what you want. This is the second step that I find almost exclusively no one does. this big question of what you really want your landscape to do for you. So that becomes what we call a vision and a goal. So do you want a landscape that's a quiet meditation area? Do you want a landscape that's home to every kid in the neighborhood comes and plays sports in your yard? Do you want a place for host big family gatherings and parties? Those are three different landscapes. And if you don't really understand what your goals are, you are going to have a really hard time measuring the success of your design. In design, one of the things that most people struggle with is there is no right answer. There are good, better, and best answers, but there's rarely an equation that tells you if you got it right. You have to set your own equation. You have to create your own measuring stick. And that comes from setting goals and a vision. And what this does is it also incorporates your family, your significant other, who else might be interacting on that land, to have a good conversation on what do we really want here. And I'll talk about what that creates and why that is water-wise, or what that effort creates from a water-wise standpoint. So we ask people to look at their goals and to answer this question: what do you really want on your site? And when people don't ask this question, what we end up with are places like this, and I showed this image earlier, full neighborhoods that are incredibly thirsty, but aren't actually providing much from an enjoyment standpoint. If you lived in this neighborhood, you're likely more frustrated with your property because you have to mow it every Saturday than you are enjoying it. These spaces are pretty underutilized. I'm going to zoom into one particular lot. This is anywhere USA, anywhere Utah probably. But these are very large lots, very expensive homes. But if we were to zoom into this property here in yellow, and we take a closer look at it, what goals does this property accomplish? If you were to ask this homeowner, this is a theoretical question, you don't need to answer, just in your own mind, what does this landscape accomplish? What activities can you do here? What can you not do here? What does this do for this family or the people that live in this home? Likely the answer is very little, especially if we think about the volume of water resources it takes to maintain this landscape. It actually isn't paying us back very much. So what we end up with is neighborhoods of large, vast amounts of underutilized space that aren't accomplishing much. So yeah, it keeps the family busy weeding, fertilizing, and mowing. Anybody that grew up on a property like this, like that mowed every Saturday morning, know what this feels like. It's a great place for a soccer game every, once a month, but it doesn't actually do that much. If you look at this house, where are the social gathering spaces? Where does the house welcome people from the street? Where in the back does it allow for private gatherings, cooking, sports, enjoyment, playgrounds, garden areas, whatever? All those things are missing, and therefore, sort of when we don't know what else to do, we tend to put out what's inexpensive to begin with, and that tends to be thirsty things like turf. So we can see that in this property, this property doesn't really generate very much from a livability or an enjoyment standpoint. So the return on investment for that water is pretty low, and we have this a lot, right? This is pretty common. So we ask people to really think through what elements are going to help you accomplish your goals. What is going to help you accomplish your vision? And that is stuff like on the left, where things you want, and then things on the right, things you need. You've got to have a place to put your trash cans, for example. You need a tool shed to support your garden. These are things that creating that list generates value in your property. Okay. And what we find is when people really think through, especially in a group, what they really want with their family or other landowners, or stakeholders, I guess you could say, in your private residence. A lot of things, they realize there's a lot of stuff that they want that takes up space, that then they can start to design and create relationships with. Okay, so the next step we look at, and this is the most sort of abstract step, is developing what we call a functional diagram. Okay, yes, Brenda, good point. Where do you store snow, right? That's a need that when you don't think about it, like right now, there's a lot of people that are struggling to figure out where to put all that snow. So we start to look at functional relationships. So what is the relationship between a sandbox and a play structure and a deck, for example? What is the relationship between an orchard and a garden and a deck? Is there optimal arrangements of elements that you created in that big list, the things you need and the things you want? Are there ways you can arrange them in ways that are optimal? But you know that there's that old adage, form follows function. This is function, okay? And I'll show you how form follows it, okay? So this is kind of the last step in the understanding yourself and your property phase. In the workshop we're teaching now, we ask people to do all this stuff up front through a series of homework assignments where they go out and measure and create base maps and do a site inventory analysis. They create a vision and goals and all that stuff to force them to think through these steps, because these are steps that I find are easy to step over in sort of overconfidence. Like, I know my property, I know what I want. And when you really think about it, you might not. And you miss opportunities to plan spaces that do not require water, that actually help your landscape function, and it helps you actually accomplish more of what you really want out of your landscape beyond just weeding and mowing and watering and fertilizing. Okay, so the next step is what we call making it yours. This is where we're going to apply maybe what you would consider and traditionally think of as design. I do want to be clear that everything you've done in the process to this point is design. Design is the process. It is not the product. So what we ask people to do is generate what we call concept plans, where they're marrying the bubbles, the relational functions to their own site. So they're respecting where there's areas where there's water, where there's areas of intense sun, where the sun is reflecting off the building. You know, those are places where you want to put certain things and not put other things. But those things also have relationships between each other. So this seems very simple, but it's something you can do very quickly. The power of design is doing things iteratively and learning from each time you do it. So this is something that we kind of, we ask people to generate a bunch of these. The problem is if anybody here is a contractor on, you realize you can't build anything from a bunch of bubbles, right? This is not what you would share with your neighbor and say, this is what we're going to build. So when you find a concept plan that you like, you know, you've done a whole bunch of these arrangements of bubbles, you've checked your site inventory analysis to make sure that those things align with each other and they're the most optimal relationship in the optimal place on your site. Then we are going to apply what you traditionally know as design. It is taking apart this landscape and applying the principles and elements of design. For those of you who have ever taken an art class, even probably a music class, these are the same general ingredients everybody has to work with. Good designers just know how to work with them better, okay? And the reason we teach this in this workshop and the why I'm teaching it to you is because it creates a vocabulary so you can have the landscapes around you act as teachers. It helps you see and take apart properties or places you've been and see what's working about them well and communicate that either to yourself or to someone else. Just like great chefs know how to taste a good dish and take it apart, and great musicians know how to listen to music and take it apart and replicate it, great designers know a vocabulary to take things apart and replicate it as well. So the way that I think about this is like, you know, this is sort of a scientist, but a chef, right? These ingredients we all have and the ratios at which we mix these in are the difference between something really delicious and something maybe not so delicious. So I'm going to go through a few of these principles and elements to help give you a flavor of what we look at as designers. So the first is form. It's that large, the shapes and the dimensions that we use to create overarching structures. You know, like On the left, squares and rectangles. Everything in there is a square and rectangle, or most things. And because of that, you can read it as a cohesive design. On the right-hand side, everything's radial, right? Those decisions to do anything, if you were to choose a bench or any aspect, it's probably going to have a radial feel to it so that that design holds itself together. We also play with colors, and I'll talk about how we mix and match these things. And then we play a lot with textures. Textures are a pretty powerful way to engage people in wanting to touch and move through a site because of the interesting textures we have. Okay, so the other aspect that I want to talk a lot about today is this idea of unity. And this is something I see, I'm going to kind of go into depth on this, that we struggle with in water-wise landscape designs. I love that. Yes, no, the compost near the noisy neighbor. Yes, on purpose. But there is a purpose, right? There was a reason for putting the bubble there. So when it comes to unity, water-wise designs, or I guess our traditional designs, tend to be unified by a single element. So I'm going to show you an image. Now, what I want you to pay attention to in a couple of these is where your eyes move. Okay, so I'm going to share an image. I want you to be very conscious to how your eyes move around the image. So likely you scanned the chaos of the pillows and your eyes ended up resting on the white couch. So the white couch in this room is what is holding the disparate lamps, and there's a blue wall under the light or under the windows, gray walls on the side, brown drapes, every kind of throw pillow you can imagine of every size. There are one shape, which is nice, but they're every color, and that white couch ties it all together. In the Intermountain West, turf is the white couch of our designs typically. It is something that no matter what we kind of throw around, it ties everything together. Okay, so this, you could have a lot of different plants, you could have a lot of different trees, you can have stuff on the driveway. That green swath holds any kind of disparate design together. Okay, and we have used it and abused it, but it's there for a reason. And then when we eliminate turf as the unifying element, we need to replace it with something else. So I want you to do the same exercise again. Pay very close attention to how your eyes move through this image. And I want you to compare it to how your eyes move in this image. Your eyes probably found their way up the path and to the front door, perhaps. They followed that line, but it was a pretty casual eye movement. This one may have been a lot more erratic for you. There's not a lot of places your eyes know where to go because there's an immense amount of variety and not very much unity. The unity that's happening in this landscape is the turf and the patio or the gray stone. More likely than anything, your eyes bounced around to a whole bunch of colors and then it rested in the grass. And so what happens is we tend to pull the unifying element out of our landscapes, which again is often turf, and we do a one-to-one replacement of unifying it with some other water-wise approach like gravel or mulch. And this is maybe one of the major critiques and heartburn that people have with water-wise landscape designs when we do a one-to-one replacement. The opposite can be said when one of the other critiques is water-wise landscapes are weedy or rangy or unkept. When you hear those words as a designer, I hear there's too much variety and not enough unity. Okay, so kind of keep an eye out for that as you're going around and looking at water-wise landscape designs where we've tipped the balance. Andrew, I hear the maintenance, right? But they're on the right or even the left. There's a lot going on here. Even if it was trimmed back, there's a lot of variety and not enough unity happening in here. There's too much cayenne pepper maybe and not enough whatever balances cayenne pepper out. So where do we look for unity in a xeric landscape design? So this is sort of where my brain spent a lot of time thinking about how do you create unity. And what I'm finding more and more is ways to create unity happen when we apply form. So if you look at these spaces, these are pretty xeric spaces, but they're sticking with a form that ties the landscape together. On the left, it's very much squares and rectangles. On the right, maybe more of a curvilinear naturalistic form. But that form permeates the entire design and holds the design together despite a lot of a reasonable amount of variety happening there. It's not uninteresting, but it's not overly weedy or rangy, whatever you want to call it. So what we do with students, or what we ask our participants to do, is take their bubbles and explore different forms. So on the left, it's the exact same bubbles, the exact same elements, right? There's a patio, there's an entrance, there's a grass area, there's a garden. And to explore different form studies is what we call them. But forcing participants to double down on some sort of form that they feel comfortable with. Okay, and these forms can be aesthetics, right? Some people really like the naturalistic curvilinear stuff. Some people really like squares and rectangles. Some people want more kind of energy, so they go with more of an irregular pattern. But your home can inspire this, the architecture of your home, your general aesthetic presence or preference can inspire this. But you know that this form is going to function because you've already done the work of putting the bubbles into place. Okay, so this is trying to find that sweet spot of unity, variety, and harmony. And what I'm finding more and more is those landscapes that adopt a strong form tend to weather the storms of over variety, over unity better than those that don't commit to a form. Okay, so what I'm advocating for is when you pull out something like turf as a unifying element, you've got to replace it with something else that's equally unifying, that's not overly bland, like a sea of turf, or a sea of gravel, or a sea of mulch, for example. Okay, so this is a nice mixture of unity and variety. This also is another example of two things. One, it's unity, variety, but it's also program elements in a backyard that may have been, you could have neglected them in a sea of turf, right? If this was your backyard, they've said, well, I want a fire pit, and I want a seating area, and I want an outdoor kitchen, and I want an area to sit with my friends. And they've expanded the amount of uses in this property in lieu of a large piece of turf. And I'm not a turf hater. There are clear reasons for it existing. But when we have it in places where other program elements could succeed, we've wasted an opportunity to diversify our property. The other thing we want to think about is balance. We have asymmetrical balance on the right, symmetrical balance on the left. How do we balance our properties? We teach and talk a lot about how to create emphasis and focal points, how to move people's eyes through your property. All of these plants that are emphasized are only emphasized because they're in a sea of other plants that support them. If there was all Japanese maples that were turning red at the same time, you wouldn't have an emphasis here. Another principle that's important is remembering scale, both scale to your home, and as well as the big moves you make. The size of this driveway, the big arc that it takes, the number of plants that are massed together reflect the largeness of this building. I see a lot of residential landscapes where everything is underscaled, and it makes the house feel enormous. The flower beds are too small. The landing for the welcome mat is too small. The back patio is too small, because and it makes the house feel enormous and the landscape feel insignificant. So dealing with scale and proportion. Also, this idea of, regardless of whether it's water-wise or not, is we are about creating space. We're about creating outdoor rooms that facilitate a function that you figured out in your visioning process. These are great spaces for different uses. What I find is most residential landscapes lack any kind of spatial dimension. They're really vast and uninteresting. So it's easy, right? The key to it, again, is to try, assess what you're doing, get a critique from yourself or someone else, and then try again and do it over and over and over again. The cool thing about design is more or less free, right? Paper is inexpensive. To spend time, as if you're doing it yourself, to think and draw and sketch and make mistakes. It's basically a free sandbox until you pay someone to put something in or do it yourself. So the fourth step is really those details that we talked about that people kind of get fixated on. One of them that is really important is this idea of establishing hydrozones. The idea of planting plants that like the same soils and like the same water requirements in places on your property that have those requirements allows you to do so much from a water management standpoint. So, and they can be as simple as this. This is that same residence, very low water requirements, medium and high water requirements is as simple as you can get. And this allows us to design our irrigation structures. It also allows us to think about how we're going to move water on our site. In the Intermountain West, we get an enormous amount of water, sometimes at the wrong time of year. So the idea of how do I move water to where I want it and soak it into the ground so that the plants that I have can actually get a hold of it, and I don't just let it move off my property and miss that opportunity to harness the water that I'm already receiving. There's a tremendous amount of technological ways, like rain barrels or cisterns, but there's a lot of simple ways of getting really good soil full of organic matter and letting water get to it, and then putting things on it that want to use that water. And that can be done through this idea of hydrozoning and then grading your property to move water where you want it. Other detail that people get really excited about is plants. I like plants, but I want each plant to provide me something in return for the water I'm spending on them. So as a designer, I might be looking at plants as a way to provide form or emphasis. It's a way to get color and variety, perhaps. It's also a way to get some texture into my property. When we start to think about plants as workers, as contributors in our landscape, we might be more selective about where they go and who makes it on the team in our landscape. So we want them to be problem solvers. We teach a lot about planting design. I'm just going to cover a couple of simple tips. One is, and the simplest thing you can do is mass your plants together. These images, plants are kind of scattered all over the place. They kind of stand alone. There's a lot of variety of different colors and textures, and there's not a lot that ties them together in either of these landscapes, which can make it feel kind of chaotic. Versus this, where you have a smaller plant palette and they're grouped and massed together so that they have a lot more power as a single plant. So these are just a couple of simple ideas, ways to deal with plants. I do want to just highlight this idea of turf. In Utah, we're really focused on non-functional turf. Turf that isn't accomplishing its given destiny of being a great place to run and play and wrestle, not just a place that holds the dirt down. There are higher and better uses. We also talk a lot about irrigation technology. This is not good irrigation technology, by the way. You have one that's spraying your leaned over mailbox, and the other one's a giant geyser off trying to water a very small park strip. You've all seen this kind of irrigation. There's an enormous amount of technology out there that helps make your irrigation efficient. My point in the design process is if you're making poor design decisions efficient, maybe go back to the poor design decisions rather than trying to update or make it more efficient. Like, ask that question: do we need to water this, or is there a better use for this area? And there's an enormous amount of non-functional turf. I bet most people can eliminate 25 to 30% of their turf on their property and transfer that into something water-wise, and they wouldn't even miss it. They're just going to miss out on some more mowing on Saturday morning. So where I'm at kind of personally, I don't think we're at the point in the Intermountain West where all native, like wild landscapes are acceptable yet. We're not ready to rethink pretty, as the Monarch Garden Company wants you to think. And we're not quite where, we want to pretend that gravel is grass. This landscape, is basically a one-to-one replacement, and they got a lot of backlash for it. And this happens all over the place. There's a lot of issues with that. I think we can do better than seas of gravel. This was when you're in denial, right? We as a state are continuing to be in denial. And denial looks like this from a landscape standpoint. We're sort of in denial about what our landscapes are doing and how we can use our limited water resources better. But this also landscape is equally uninteresting, but greener, right? Than the one we just showed in gravel. It's not fulfilling much more than that one was. So I think the idea, or what I'd like to propose, is this idea that we need to ask ourselves and those we work with some of these fundamental questions that I highlighted in steps 1 through 3 before we get frustrated that we're only applying the details that really haven't created the results or the changes that we're hoping for. I think water-wise landscape design can be and should be more than just aesthetics. It needs to be something functional, and that comes from really asking those questions that are not terribly fun, but are incredibly important. So hopefully this has made you think a little differently about design as a method for looking at your landscapes differently. If so, that's great. I'm happy to talk a little bit about questions. I know there's been a few that have popped up. Sheetal, are you the one that moderates Q&A?
Yes, I can do that. And the first question that we have is from Dan. He has 2 things there. Please discuss. 1, actual residential outdoor water use versus total outdoor water use. That is 6% lawn versus 82% goes to agriculture in Utah. Mm-hmm. Does desert landscaping have any actual impact? Is it really water-wise? And one thing I would like to add in here, Dan, is any amount of water that we stop from going to lawn or our landscape is the water that would be saving to the culinary supply, versus agricultural water is the water that needs to be treated, and there need to be a lot of money going into treatment and making it drinkable, versus the 6% or whatever amount that we are saving in our landscape is usually from the culinary water. Sometimes maybe secondary water, but usually culinary. So that brings in some saving. Jake, you want to take anything on this?
Yeah, excellent kind of political question that I think is on a lot of people's mind. Like, does it actually do any good? I would say every drop matters. And if and this is in our state and many other states, this is an all hands on deck issue. I don't think one entity or group needs to carry the load. I do think it's a question of return on investment. If water is a precious resource, is its highest and best use going to residential landscapes that aren't, irrespective of how many gallons we're talking, is the highest and best use of that water watering things that aren't actually advancing our needs, our wants, or our desires? So that's where I'm kind of at. I'm a big fan of landscapes, obviously, but I've seen there's an enormous amount of landscapes that are very unsatisfying to individuals and communities writ large that are taking a vast amount of water. The whether it's ag's job or our job to save water, I think the answer is yes. Everybody's job is to save water. I think to Sheetal's point as well, I grew up in a home where my dad went around and closed all the taps and, made sure there was no leaks in our house and wouldn't let you flush the toilet when there was droughts and all that stuff. He was very, very adamant about saving water. But that is non-consumptive water. Like, your water comes in a pipe, it gets pulled out of a reservoir or a river. It comes in a pipe, we use it, it goes in a drain and goes back to a wastewater treatment plant and likely enters a water body again. We kind of get that water back and we only lose a portion of it. Outside water use, agriculture water use, we don't really get much of that water back. A lot of it gets evapotranspirated. So that 60% is not only a big number, but it's water we only get to use once. And, to some degree, there's a greater loss to the system in an external exterior water use than an internal water use. And I think that's important to recognize as we're trying to conserve water, is both volume and return on investment.
Awesome. And the second question he had was, also please discuss drawbacks of hardscape landscaping, such as increasing urban temperature, absorbing heat from the sun and releasing it in the surrounding areas both day and night.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of concern about this idea of urban heat island of as we, if you were to take out turf and replace it with hardscape or rock, have you significantly increased your temperature around your home? The answer is yes, it does increase the temperature around your home. Is it significant? I think the jury's still out on that. I don't know of any really solid research. I think if we could plant trees strategically that shade our homes and our landscapes and didn't have the turf, I don't know if you'd notice that much of a difference. I don't know if turf, for example, is cooling our environments to the point where we couldn't do it differently. Like a tree would probably, a shading effect or shade structures might do as good a job of cooling our environments as enormous amounts of turf. Again, it's a return on investment. Is it worth the water to have that cooling effect? So I think it's important that we don't ignore that. And I don't want to dismiss, Dan, you're right on that. There is heat that is stored in hardscapes and gravel that is not stored in plant materials.
Yeah, that's true.
Materials are cooling. But I think that there is the concern that if we did do more xeriscape, that also not all of our neighborhoods will be significantly hotter. I don't think that's the case unless they're like barren wastelands with only gravel.
Yes. And even with the turf trade programs, I think you need to cover this much, like some portion of your landscape with the green coverage. So that goes with it. The next question is from Morgan. How do you approach city landscape code when creating these designs? When they require plant coverage percentage, mulch type, etc. Yep.
Yeah, great question. So those initial stages of like knowing your site, there is a lot of that goes into researching your city codes, understanding your setbacks. No site is independent or an island. Everything's part of a context. Your neighbors, your city, all have different rules and regulations. So understanding that becomes things I would advise people drawing that on their base map, saying, I can't plant anything here. I got to be this far off of my fence before I make a structure. All those things are the realities of the world we live in. And design accepts those realities rather than working against them. So it's a really great question. When it comes to city codes, I think that's one of the exciting things we've seen the last couple of years is a lot of those codes that limited the amount of variation we could have with water-wise landscapes here in the state of Utah have shifted almost 180 degrees to saying, instead of requiring 80% of your property be lawn, now they're requiring 80%, 20% of it to be lawn or something like that. They've actually limited some of those techniques that before they forced us to do. So I think moving forward, there's more and more possibilities to do more water-wise landscapes that we didn't have in the past.
Yep. And the other question was from Lauren, do you have the list of favorite perennials for low water in the mountain zone, like 4 to 5 that you would recommend? And I put in some links in there for Conservation Garden and CWEL. I think there's enough plants in that list.
Yeah, and I don't want to diatribe too much on this, but I try to avoid plant lists a little bit because the nursery industry is always moving plants. They're always, if plants aren't selling, they kind of retire them, and there's new, better varieties or different varieties coming out. Plant lists are typically kind of out of date as soon as they're printed, even though they're great. What I find is a lot of people walk in with a plant list and say, I want all these things. And the nursery says, we don't we only carry half of those. I'm a big fan of thinking of plants as like, what do you want them to do? So I need 7 large deciduous trees that have amazing fall color and they don't drop seeds. I would rather go to a nursery with that kind of question and have them show me what they have than say, I need a, autumn blaze maple, and they say, I need 7 of them. They say, well, I only got 4. Like, well, my whole design's ruined now. I think it respects a lot of the amazing resources in our nursery industry. But I would use plant lists as a starting point, but recognize that those are not the gospel truth. What is in the nursery and available is really what we have to work with. So use them as an idea place, but know what you want those plants to do. And then when you go to the nursery and they say, well, there's actually a better variety that does what you want it to do, and we have it. It's around the corner. Also, don't be enamored by the thing in bloom when you walk through the front door. That's the other thing I see is if you're walking through a nursery with a cart and you have 1 plant, you're going to end up with a chaotic landscape and not a unified one. You should have groups of 3 or 5 or 7 typically that help kind of force you to mass things together.
Awesome. Yeah. And this is an interesting conversation. So I wanted to keep it going, but anyone, like we are 3 or 2. So anyone leaving, I think if you need CEUs, we have UNCP, Doppelcore, QL, and IACUs. Please email me for that. And once you close the webinar, I think we'll go to you'll be guided to a link for survey. So please feel free to fill that and provide your feedback. But yeah, we'll move on. Jake, you have time, right?
Yeah. So I did want to highlight, there was a question there about, is this kind of stuff taught online? We have it 2 ways. One is a hybrid online and then in person. We spend a couple weeks, people working on their own properties online, and then an evening and a day in person. And then I just threw a link in there. There's a course that's all online that asks you to go through these steps and sort of gives you, talks to you about how to measure and what to look for. And it's sort of a self-guided design course. I would as well, I know a lot of people are using the local scapes courses. Those are another great way to get ideas and bounce ideas. They have a very simple kind of set of guidelines or principles that are great. They're really helpful. What I found that they don't have, that a lot of people I know have taken the class struggle with, is some of the site inventory and analysis. And so actually the course that I just put the link in, we actually point you to local scapes as a way to think through this stuff, because there's a lot of great things you can learn from the local scapes program. And they also have in-person classes, online modules. So I find kind of our goal was to blend the best of both of those together to help give you the most resources possible.
Awesome. So the next one is
okay, I will throw the link, and I think I sent it to the panelists, which is nobody. So hold on a minute. Thank you for letting me know, Stephen.
Brian and Ned have similar questions, like how does Utah view artificial turf, or artificial turf versus Utah? Any take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I find is, I don't know if Utah has a stance on that. I think some of the major concerns with artificial turf that I've heard is heat. It is that dark green minus the evapotranspiration that keeps it cool. So I know that people have expressed concerns about that. Where I do see it being valuable is if you are just looking for the aesthetic visual impact of a big green lawn, or that splash of green that unifies things, I think, and you're not planning on rolling on it very often and playing on it, like sometimes that will work. Really what I found is when people start to see turf as an element that's doing things for them or not doing things for them, it allows different ideas. Like if you say, well, I need a green swath to kind of unify this area that's a little bit chaotic, then that green swath doesn't have to be turf. It can be artificial turf. It could be a low water variety of turf. It could be, clover. It could be all kinds of different things when you realize that the purpose of that grass is, and I'm using grass as an example, but the purpose of anything is to create a visual or a functional effect, then kind of unplugging that and plugging a new one in that matches that same effect becomes a little easier. When we get fixated on it has to be turf or a tree or something, it really limits our ability to think about the water impacts and adjust for those.
So the next one that we have is, it seems to me that Colorado and Arizona are doing water-wise landscaping better than we are. What are they doing differently? This is the top one.
Wow, Tom, that's a burn. There is a lot of looking over the fence, and I think Colorado is where xeriscape started. It was, I think, done by the Denver Water District way back when, and they've had probably a decade or more, probably 2 decades up on Utah as far as acceptance. I do agree. There's a lot of really good work that's being happened, both at the private level, but also at the commercial level of people, installers, designers that are better versed at native plants. They're better versed at water capturing. They're better versed at managing stormwater. I think it's because they've been doing it a little longer, and maybe the political environment has allowed for that a little bit more. I think we're making our way there. I think Arizona's done it mainly because they were forced to, and there's because of their environment, and they don't quite have the same vernacular landscape challenges that we have. They're not dragging as much historic baggage as we are. They have a little bit of a Spanish influence that is more accepting aesthetically of the desert landscape than we have kind of further north, where we're still reeling from this idea of for the desert to blossom like a rose, it needs to look like the countryside of England or Illinois. That I think culturally we're still struggling with when it comes to seeing things differently. But I would agree. I think there's some great examples, some great books, manuals that are coming out of Colorado, that have come out of Colorado, that fit very well with a similar ecotone and system that we have here in Utah. And if you're in southern Utah, Arizona is a great place to look over that fence and see what they're doing.
Awesome. So Danielle asks, for sloped design, grass provide good erosion control. Any quick suggestions for low water alternatives? I will send a link here again with where she can find plants. But again, do you want to take this?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You don't specifically recommend plants because that would change. But again, you want to take it?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess what I would say to that question is, yes, turf does a great job of holding the dirt down, but can we do better? And I think what you're maybe pointing to is, are there some plants out there that will hold the dirt in place on a hill slope? Turf on hills is incredibly hard to water and keep happily watered, especially if they're facing south or southwest. You're going to be fighting to keep that grass happy. But I do think there's an opportunity to say, I don't need turf. I need something to hold down. I need something to manage erosion. And as Sheetal said, there's a myriad of plants that can do that may serve a similar function. Everything from and I'm not a plant expert by any means. The clovers or the mints or the all kinds of different ground covers that could do the same work, that are not quite as thirsty as the turf.
Okay, good. So do you have any plans to present in Summit, Wasatch counties? I think it's designed for every drop, I guess. Yeah,
that's a good question. So we are finishing up our last 2 workshops this spring, one in Murray and one in Logan. And those have closed. The registration is closed because we are working with those cohorts, both in person and online. We are hoping and planning on doing another round in the fall, and we can share information through CWEL or something to get registered for that. But yes, it is a statewide effort. This year we did St. George, Vernal, Murray, Logan, and Bluff, actually. So we kind of started south and moved north in the hopes that the weather would be better, but it seems like we miscalculated this winter, and people are constantly measuring their landscapes in the snow. But we do hope to do it in the fall again. The workshop was funded generously through Extension as a pilot, and we're hoping to continue that effort. And maybe we'll drag Chantal along to teach with us.
Yeah, and just like I'm getting a lot of questions on where this will be. Once we are done with preparing this after the webinar, we'll post it on our YouTube channel, WaterWell with CWEL, and you can go back, watch it as many times as you want. With that, I think we are all done for today, and thank you everyone for coming. If you need access to CEUs, please let me know, email me, and I'll send it to you. Thank you, Jake. It was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Chantal, and thank you for the great chatter in the chat. It's been a really awesome, active group, and hopefully people learn something they can apply to their own work. So
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.